Stanford wanted to know if his horse ever had a moment during its trot when all four hooves were off the ground. The man he chose to settle the bet was the photographer Eadweard Muybridge.
If you like history, give that creator a follow. I only discovered them a couple weeks ago and I'm really enjoying the videos. And the last one was about Muybridge, who I think is so cool. So I will discuss a book, of course, as well as a science article about myosin in muscles, as well as a really cool animation that I know. So let's start with the book. This is Animals in Motion. This is the Dover edition, and this is all of Muybridge's photos, or as many as you can fit into a book. This is the most cheaply available way to get as many of Muybridge's photos as you can. And so if you don't know about Muybridge, Eadweard Muybridge was a pioneer of photography. And one of the big questions in the 1870s when he was doing this work was, when a horse is running, do all its feet leave the ground or not? And people would have endless debates about this because you couldn't really be sure. It looked like it, but there was no proof. And so what he did was he would take strings attached across a race course, and whenever the horse would hit the string, it would set off a camera. And so he would have a lot of cameras set up. He had a huge amount of funding from the University of Pennsylvania, and he produced over 400,000 images over the course of his career. And so he would use this as a first generation flash burst photography to make primitive motion pictures about what was actually happening during the horse's gallop. And he discovered that yes, indeed, they do leave the ground. Though surprisingly, it's not when their feet are outstretched. It's actually when the legs come towards each other is when it leaves the ground. But he didn't just take pictures of horses running. He took pictures of all kinds of animals. You can see jaguars leaping here, ostriches, camels. And the reason that this is so filled with things for me is it's just so interesting. It's been a classic for artists for a long time. And it's not just animals either. He also has things like an elderly man lifting a log, or a woman sweeping or climbing a ladder. He was using this new field of photography to study how things move, the muscles, and the science of motion. And it is really fascinating stuff. I even used some of the pictures of an elephant in my book, The Crown, where the phytocannabinoids are elephants and the endocannabinoids are whales. What is a whale but an elephant of the ocean? The next piece of the puzzle comes from Nature magazine. Welcome to the age of protein cinematography. And I will put a PDF of this article in the Discord because you can't get it behind the paywall. But the big question is about myosin, which is one of the main proteins in muscles. And since the 50s, they knew that there was some kind of grasping, pulling thing that myosin would do to make muscles contract. And there was a guess that it was kind of a ratchet motion that it would make. And that became the main idea. But still, no one has ever seen that, even though it's been the idea for 70 years. Until now, in the spirit of Muybridge, there is a technique of microscopy called cryo-electronic microscopy. And you've probably heard of electron microscopy where using the electrons as a probe, but this is cryo, so it means it's frozen. So things are moving much, much slower. And not only is it slower, they modified the myosin to be slower than it normally is. And so with this slowed down myosin, they use cryo-electronic microscopy to take 2 images. And that's all they have 2 frames, but it was enough to show and confirm the decades-old debate that indeed it is a ratchet motion that the myosin was making. Right now, this field is still in its infancy, and there's no commercially available time-resolved cryo-electron microscopy pieces of equipment out there. And the main 2 techniques that are being used is an open source light trigger device that is very much like Muybridge. The motion makes it trigger. And then there's one that uses lasers that is much more expensive, but might be better at resolving more fleeting events. But each lab that's doing this work has to build their own rig at this point. But in the spirit of Muybridge, they are, which I think is really, really cool. Lastly is this beautiful and rather haunting animation by Koji Yamamura from 2011 called Muybridge's Strings. And it also touches upon the life of Muybridge, which was quite intense. When he was younger, he was thrown from a stagecoach, and it gave him a bad head injury that seemed to somewhat change his personality, which was important to him later because he married a young divorcee and had a kid with her. And then she took up with another guy, and eventually, after a bunch of back and forth, Muybridge went up to the guy and said, "I have a message for my wife." and he shot him at point-blank range, and the guy died of his wound not too long after. And Muybridge cooperated with the police, but put up a strong defense, and the jury eventually acquitted him, saying that they would have done the same thing in his situation. But he had no longer had anything really to do with his kid besides paying for his care, as he went off and did things like lots of commissions for the U.S. government and photographing important sites around the U.S. and across the world as well, and then continuing his research into animal motion, though he eventually fell out with his big funder, Stanford. But he seems like a pretty intense guy, but sometimes the greatest artists often are. Speaking of, I want to give a shout out to the National Film Board of Canada, because they were the ones who funded this animation. And when I have this huge animation collection, and so often a great piece is funded by them. And I just think it's so cool how they spend their government money to make beautiful pieces of art. So that animation, learn more about Muybridge, or Animals in Motion is another great way to go.